Yes, you read that right. I think The Simpsons Wrestling is a good game. Growing up, The Simpsons Wrestling set nestled between The Phantom Menace and The Philosopher's Stone in my PlayStation 1 collection. The Simpsons Wrestling, along with Crash Team Racing, were the two PS1 games you'd always play when you had friends over. But for some reason, all those other games are now looked on with nostalgic fondness, yet poor Simpsons Wrestling has become the butt of everyone's jokes. It's even described on Wikipedia as one of the worst games of all times. Where's the citation, huh? Who even said that? And so, I've decided to make a case for The Simpsons Wrestling being a good game. Oh, and I also invited the developers to help give insight into the game. Mike Ebert and Ray West are veteran game developers. Mike worked on several LucasArts games such as Zombies Ate My Neighbors and Herc's Adventures. He also co-founded Big 8 Production, the studio behind the Phantom Menace game. Meanwhile, Ray was the 3D modeler and animator for The Simpsons Wrestling. Okay, let's start by getting the negatives out of the way. One of the biggest criticisms of this game were the graphics. And as it turns out, there is a reason why the game turned out looking the way it did.
Fox required the black lines to be drawn around the characters, which on the PS1 was really taxing, because we were going to just do 3D rendered characters without the little black cartoon line. And putting that black cartoon line on there just killed a lot of the performance. We had to change the rendering.
I think we lowered our resolution at that point, too. We were actually going to be 640 by 480 and then wound up using something smaller than that.
Fun fact, if you'd like to play this game the way the developers intended, you can turn off the outlines using cheats. Another much maligned part of the game is the ugly looking character select screen where the characters look like they were drawn by an 8-year-old in paint who had seen maybe half an episode of The Simpsons. Well, it turns out the devs had a completely different selection screen planned.
We had a lot of disappointments like that from Fox where we put some very cool things in. Ray probably definitely remembers the taunting character select screen.
Yeah, the interactions where they could reach over and smack each other.
It was 3D rendered characters on the 3D characters on the select screen, and when you're selecting different fighters, they would sort of trash talk each other. Sometimes they'd reach out of their frame and hit the other character right next to them. So it was almost like a little fight on the character select screen. And we took it to a convention and we had it functioning that way. And then they came back and said, we'd like to replace that with concept art from the show.
Another criticism of The Simpsons Wrestling is the lack of actual wrestling. Most of the combat consists of the characters just smacking and slapping each other. Here is what the developers had to say about that.
My only real problem with that game was I just think it never should have been called wrestling.
Right.
It should have been like Simpsons Brawl or something, because the word wrestling made everybody think this is a pro wrestling game. And they were expecting professional wrestling moves. And just if we had just called it something else, I think it would have done a lot better. Because we got a lot of negative reviews like, there's no professional wrestling moves. This is crazy. And it's like, no, this is just a sort of slapstick fighting game with a bunch of crazy characters.
Yeah, I actually wonder if we had gone more of a Power Stone route where it's like each locale was not a square ring, but was just the ability to have run around interior of power plant or whatever, just like having multiple levels and stuff that you interact with, if that would have felt like a different game.
Alright, enough about the negatives. Let's talk about some of the cool things about this game. The action always happens inside the ring, however, there are a bunch of different environments around the ring that you can choose from. But my favorite stage is the Itchy and Scratchy level where you play inside the television. Turns out this was an Easter egg Mike put into all of his games.
Dean and I, when we started working in games, we always did post-credit levels. If you go back, Zombies Ate My Neighbors, there's a bonus level at the end where you fight monsters inside LucasArts. It was actually our offices. We mapped it out in the map editor, and George Lucas makes an appearance in there, and you actually fight the monsters. And then when we did Herc's Adventures, I think we did a behind the scenes as if it was like behind a movie set. The cameras are there, and you're going behind and seeing everybody that made the video game. So it just seemed like a natural thing for us to do this because we've been doing it in every game we've done so far.
The game does also use original voice actors, and the dialogue does differ depending on the character matchups.
Who are you wrestling, Willie?
Okay, that's pretty common these days, but come on, this is a 22-year-old game. And it turns out the developers got to write the lines themselves.
We wrote the lines ourselves, and we expected that somebody was going to go through them. No, they recorded them. The lines that we wrote, they came back in the voices of the characters. It was like, it was a miracle, and like we got the raw takes. I remember Hank Azaria busting up laughing at some line that one of us wrote, and that was like, yes, we have peaked in our careers.
Unfortunately, not all of their dialogue made it to the final game.
So we wrote all this dialogue, and the actors recorded it, and they wrote some too, actually, and added to it. We had our testers actually come back to us and say, the dialogue in the Simpsons Wrestling game is so offensive, I would never allow my child to play it. And we had to cut out a large number of the things that they said, and they were right. They were just going off on the trash talking and said, this is just downright offensive. And so there was a whole bunch of Simpsons recorded lines by the voice actors that just never saw the light of day because this would never even been on the show.
And speaking of cut content, turns out there was an entire level the developers had to cut from the game last second.
This was around the time of the Columbine shooting, or around that, maybe it was after the Columbine shooting. We were asked right in the middle of production to remove the school level and all references to the school. So I do believe we shipped with no level that involved Bart at school or the school bus driver or anything, because they were afraid that somehow having a fight at the school would make people think of the Columbine shooting.
So growing up and playing Simpsons Wrestling, a lot of the fun came from all the weird character matchups this game allowed for. But looking back at it, it's kind of surprising the developers were allowed to make this kids game, it's a 3+ rating here in the UK, where Homer just throws a bowling ball full pelt at his 10-year-old son, or where this middle-aged drunk can just burp in the face of an 8-year-old girl. And how about Marge smacking Homer in the face with a frying pan before getting choked? Was there any pushback on this from Fox?
So there was pushback, and it came about, I don't know, maybe a month before we're supposed to ship. They suddenly were saying, could you put these things into the game? Don't allow Homer to attack the children. Don't allow Homer to attack the wife. Don't allow these different characters to fight in any way whatsoever. I'm like, you do realize it's a wrestling game. We can't just not allow the characters to fight each other. So they apparently signed up for this product with no concept of what the end result would be. That it would, if you're going to have those characters in there, of course you're going to have them hitting each other with frying pans and fighting and having a brawl. Yeah, it was funny that the product got that far down with nobody actually thinking about that.
And speaking of characters, yes, the roster wasn't exactly huge, and the combat was a bit basic when it worked. But come on, that was never the point of this game. It was all about the characters and their over-the-top moves, like Bumblebee Man's Chihuahua, or Krusty pancaking his opponents with his mallet, or Moe the bartender throwing Molotov cocktails, Flaming Moes. But my favorite character was always Flanders. No, not because of his dress sense or his wholesome values. It's because he was by far the most overpowered character. His special move was literally getting God to strike his opponent down. Look at Reverend Lovejoy just watching and going, good, Ned, good. And this appears to have been completely unintentional.
I didn't remember him being that overpowered. It's possible that it's just, some sort of damage rounding error that made him, too much of a godlike being.
And so there we have it, The Simpsons Wrestling. Yes, studio interference stopped this game from being what it could have been, but every time I played The Simpsons Wrestling growing up, my friends and I always had a fun time. And after speaking to the developers, I realized why. This game was made by a bunch of fans for the fans. Look, I'm not trying to make the case for this being the best fighting game ever, but at the same time, I also don't think it's one of the worst games ever. Plus, it also sold really well, at least here in the UK, coming up right behind Pokemon Silver in 2001. So please let me know your thoughts on The Simpsons Wrestling. Did you enjoy playing this game growing up? Do you think it's been unfairly critiqued, or is it really as bad as some people say? Please leave a comment with your thoughts below. Also, a huge thanks to both Mike and Ray for taking the time to talk about this game. If you'd like to see more content and insights from them, then check out our deep dive into the Phantom Menace game, which they also worked on. As always, thanks for watching. Please remember to like, subscribe, hit the bell, and follow me on Twitter. See you next time.